All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Andrew Carpenter. I specialize in ERP automation. And on the call with me today is Chris. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Chris Carpenter. I am a solution architect. I specialize specifically in DevOps, continuous integration, robotic process automation, and software test automation.
All right, awesome. So today we're going to talk about a problem statement we ran into with a customer. They needed to implement a JDE regression testing suite. They were spending thousands of hours, multiple times a year, on their upgrades and new ERP rollouts with JDE. So what we did is we created a solution for them focused on JDE Orchestrator and using unified functional testing. They needed a solution that could embrace multiple applications in their ecosystem, so GUI tests and API tests. They wanted to be able to leverage their developers, their BAs, basically everybody on their QA team and ERP team in general to have a nice integrated solution here. And they wanted a centralized repository for their initiatives, which is where ALM comes into play to help them stay organized. And it doubles as a way to schedule and launch the UFT scripts.
All right, so as Andrew had just mentioned, we wanted to have an automation framework that embraced the concepts of JDE's Orchestration Studio, as well as using additional automation tools that we can use as an enterprise. So here we are in the JDE Orchestration Studio. I'm going to click into Orchestrations. And I've got an orchestration here called Enter Transfer Order Manually. An orchestration itself is actually made up of multiple, one or many service requests. So I'll show you an example of what a service request looks like. The way this was created was a business analyst had set the service request record option and walked through the business process. As you can see, we've got many different fields and buttons here, and these are all of the fields and buttons that are actually on the screen within JD Edwards itself. You can see that there's just a ton of them here, and also any grid options that are available, every single row, every single column that we have. And as we scroll down, we'll actually eventually get to one of the fields that we actually interact with, so you can see what that looks like. So here on from branch plant, we actually inject data from a variable called from branch plant. This service request will ultimately be transformed into an orchestration. As I mentioned a minute ago, the orchestration is a grouping of service requests. The orchestration is then, we then map our service request inputs. So here we've got our different variables. We've got from DC, to DC, and quantity, and then our SKU. What this allows us to do is then pass data into our service request and then execute the orchestration itself. In this screen, we are able to actually pass data into our orchestration simply by entering the data that we want to create an order for. As you can see on our output, we now have a sales order number, sales order type, sales order company, purchase order type, and purchase order company that we can consume later as we start grouping these orchestrations together. We'll actually be doing the grouping of these orchestrations through UFT and ALM. Okay, so now we've got UFT open. We're going to make sure that we're connected to ALM. Here you can see we are connected and we're logged into our regression testing project. And we're going to open a business component. I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like. So here's the orchestration that we just created, or that we just looked at in our Orchestration Studio. All right, so we've got a couple different components of a API test. We've got our start node, we have our test flow, we create a custom orchestration, and we've got our end node. So our start node, we actually have some input parameters. So these will actually be set in ALM. They'll be set or they will be linked in ALM. We've got our authentication token, our SKU, ordered quantity, and our to and from DC. You also notice that we've got some outputs. This is coming from the JSON payload. We've got our output parameters linked to those values when we get our response. Our test step, we have a orchestration. And here, we've got a couple settings. We give it a name. We can set our timeout and whatnot. Most important is going to be our actual HTTP method, our URL, our URI, and our status code. Here we've got a validation. We are doing a post. We want to make sure that this orchestration actually returns a 200. In our HTTP payload, our request, we're actually creating a payload with all of our input parameters. Our response ultimately comes back in a JSON format, and then this is some of the values that we actually return. So this orchestration is a very simple one. We have our URI, we build our payload, we map our responses to our output parameters. Very simple. Let's look at an example of a more complicated orchestration. Open a business component, and we built this custom test step called verify inventory. It takes inputs from previous components and it compares values. But we had to get a little complex with the logic, so I wanted to show you what that looks like. Try and make the screen a little bit bigger. As you can see, we've got a bunch of different activities that are happening within this component. First, we start, and here we've got a conditional statement, and we're asking ourselves, do we expect any change in our on-hand inventory? If we do not expect any change, we come and we actually compare the values of our previous inventory to our actual inventory count. We report no change is success. If there was an unexpected change, we actually report no. The second thing that we check is if there was actual change expected, are we expecting an addition to inventory at our 2DC, or are we expecting subtraction in our inventory at our 2DC? So here, if we are expecting an addition to our inventory levels, we can compare the before inventory levels, add the quantity that we had ordered, and we should have our actual inventory on hand and report a success. Otherwise, we would subtract. And we do this for all of our different inventories that we're monitoring. Here we've got committed change. Further down, we've got our actual available inventory that customers can order. And then we've got our on purchase order, and we want to monitor the different levels of inventory that are actually on our PO, which eventually will come into our warehouse. So as you can see, that's a little complex, but it shows the versatility of UFT and the ability to add conditional logic and compare values. Okay, now that we've taken a look at our UFT components, let's go into ALM and see how we actually string these all together. So here in ALM, I've got my business components, which is what we just looked at in UFT. They're actually stored in ALM. And then in our test plan, this is where we actually string them together. And we can actually link our inputs and outputs. So this looks kind of like the grid that we had in our UFT environment. We've got a start node, but these are actually the individual components that we've created. So we've got an authentication component. We actually go out and do a sales order inquiry to verify there's a sales order number. We also verify that there's a specific branch plant number. We take that branch plant number and we actually want to figure out whether it is a warehouse management type of warehouse or if it's a DC link warehouse where they actually scan everything. So this is what we call a BPT branch. This is a newer feature that came out in 12.6. And we can actually add logic. So if we are actually using a WMS warehouse DC, then we want to execute some logic. And here we actually go into WMS and we find a batch number, we print the batch, and then we confirm pick. If it equals to no, then we go out and we just do auto batch. And then if there's no match, we don't do anything. And then we automatically disconnect. So the ability to add this type of logical conditional flow into our both UFT components at the component level, and then again at ALM and that level, gives us a number of infinite possibilities on dealing with any of the types of nuances that our application throws at us.
All right, thank you, Chris. So let's look at an end-to-end scenario that we created here. I'm going to hop over to my end-to-end folder, onto my scenario. All right, so first I'll start off really quickly in grid view, then we'll take a look at the canvas view again. So in the grid view, this is a list of all of our components, and then we group our validations together into these groups here. So here's validation group 0, make it a little bit wider. You can see we have a couple validation group 1, etc. So when we're adding components in here, it's really important that we link all of our parameters together that Chris demoed to us in UFT. So if I click on the parameters, we can see our inputs and outputs. This is our very first component. That is simply our authenticate into JDE component. So this authenticates into Orchestrator, grabs a token for us. We don't have any inputs because for now they're hard-coded in. We do have an output, which will be our authentication token. And then we'll notice in all of our subsequent runs, we pass that same token in. So we have our authentication token as our first one. And then starting on the second component, we start grabbing our outputs. So here are our outputs right here, taking the item number, taking the branch plant, and we're feeding them as inputs into our transfer order manually component. So we do that all the way down to the bottom. So we have a lot of components here in our end-to-end. And I'll quickly jump over to the canvas view. It's a little bit easier to see how everything's linked together and how we're passing the data. So in our canvas view here, I will zoom in a little bit. You can see we have our start node. We go to authenticate. You can see how the data is passing here on the left. We go into our first validation group. You can see that we have 2 validations done here, again with all of our data passing. Go to our transfer order manually component. Go into our next validation group. And as you can see, we have a lot of data being passed through here. So this scenario right here takes multiple employees, and I believe it was upwards of a day to run. And this script that we're looking at right here is roughly 15 minutes or so when we execute it. So scroll all the way down to the bottom. You can see we have a lot of orchestrations in here. We have a lot of validation groups. And then ultimately we disconnect from the AIS server and our end-to-end is done. Okay, so let's hop over to the test lab and take a look at how we actually execute these tests. So we'll go to our 9.2 release here. We have 2 different versions of our end-to-end scenario, so 2 iterations here. We're going to work with the first one. We're going to set it to our execution host 02. You can always run these on the auto match host. We have 8 execution hosts in our environment, but for this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and use 02. I will hit run up here. Make sure our time slot is available to be reserved, which it is. So we'll go ahead and hit run. And while this kicks off, we're actually going to jump over to the orchestration monitor, so the JDE orchestration monitor. And once these start running, we'll be able to watch our orchestrations live here. So we'll give it a refresh, and then we'll filter by last success as they start coming in. Okay, so we can see that our first component here, enter transfer order manually, went through with a success about 12 seconds ago. So we can get live statistics as these components run.
Okay, so now our test has executed. So we will come into ALM and we will look at our run results. I actually have one here that has passed. Well, this is our HTML run results report. And as you can see, I'll just collapse all here and you can see all the different components that we've actually executed. So we authenticate components that Andrew showed you within the group components. And we've got our transfer order, the orchestration that we started with originally. So what's really great about these run results is I can click on the start node. I can actually see the authentication token that was passed in. I can see the SKU number, the to DC, the from DC, the quantity ordered. And then really what we want to look at when we look at these is the actual orchestration itself. So coming in here, we can look at the HTTP raw request that we actually send to the server. We've got our post and then our payload that we're sending. And then we can view also our response body. And this is essentially what the server is sending back to us. We can also see that we have a status code of 200, which is good. And in this case, we actually had a checkpoint looking for a status code value of 200, and this orchestration passed. Another thing that we like to look at when we look at these run results are the end nodes. So the end nodes, we can actually see our output parameters, and this helps us troubleshoot. If we have a failure downstream, we can actually see where the purchase order number actually generated, and did that purchase order number actually get sent to the component downstream. Up here in the upper right-hand corner, we also can see that we have 317 different validations that were checked. As Andrew had mentioned previously, this specific scenario, this end-to-end scenario, took numerous people an entire day, 8 hours of work, and it just executed in 15 minutes.